I think that this time around, currency wars are playing in a slightly different way. Why? Because a weaker currency, is not free lunch. Okay, you obviously have you're more competitive. So China or whoever might say, look, I'm going to devalue my currency. Please send me your money, your technology, your labor, your investment, right? And I'm going to do this. I need it. You do it at the expense of inflation, okay, and potentially creating bubbles because think about the price of oil in dollars and the price of oil in a currency that is much weaker, right? So effectively, this is a trade-off, and why trade wars are sort of checkmate on currency wars, and why it becomes so tricky. But I think this time around, you have a situation where, as you pointed out, things are a bit different, and I believe there's more room for the dollar to appreciate because, in a way, the U.S. is facing a big problem alongside everybody else, which is inflation. But by keeping a stronger dollar, they're actually passing that problem to somebody else. Or put it differently, the guys with the weaker currencies are suffering this in a bigger way. And this is part of the reason why I think the dollar has legs. I mean, we talked earlier briefly about monetary divergence. And, we've seen the Fed hiking aggressively. We've seen the ECB able to finally, after almost a decade, bring rates to zero. And this is how dire the situation's in Europe. People were panicking because we're hiking interest rates to zero. It sounds like a bad joke, but it is. Right? It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal, right? You have to go and intervene sovereign spreads because you're hiking rates to zero. That's how crazy the whole thing is. But then you have other people like China that are basically going the other way and cutting rates. But I think this ties in with many other things. And we talked about why the stronger dollar and perhaps linking it to the energy situation. This is obviously Europe is and Asia to a certain extent are suffering the energy crisis much more than the US. This is not really about crude oil prices, which is more of a global commodity. This is really about things like natural gas, which are much more regional. Okay, it's very difficult to take a gas, natural gas in the US and send it over to Europe if you don't have the pipes, which they don't exist, or if you don't have the liquefaction capacity, which is a massive engineering feat and major investments. So
right,
in that
sense, but the liquefying capacity and then the reliquefy or the regasification on the other side.
Absolutely, but this is 99.9% of the difficulties on the liquefaction. I mean, you can take natural gas and take it from current temperature to minus 200 and something, and that's the difficult part. Good luck doing it, okay? Now, once it's there, you can transport it, and then once it gets to delivery point, all you need to do is just let it expand and go into normal temperature. So the real issue here, the bottleneck, is not so much regas, is liquefaction, right? And that liquefaction are 5 to 10 billion clips that take 3, 5, 7, whatever years, and they just don't happen overnight. So
I'm sorry to interrupt, and I might be wrong here, and if I am, we can totally edit this out. But my understanding is that you need to have a specialized port to receive the liquefied natural gas, and there are only so many.
Special what?
Like a special port?
Well, yeah, but of course there are in the order of magnitude of the difficulty. I think it's largely
it's
much easier to resolve. So of course, you can just go anywhere and land anywhere. That you need certain measures, but I think the key point that we need to make people understand is that there's the natural gas crisis is creating a major divergence in energy prices and energy volumes. Okay, I'm going to elaborate on these 2 points, whereby basically, if you think about natural gas in the US, people might be following the prices of Henry Hub. And part of the problem in commodity markets is that we use very funny units, right? So every commodity has this dollars per barrel, whatever, pence per megawatt, tons, euros, whatever, tons. So when you put things apples with apples, in the case of nat gas, you need to multiply by about 5.8 to make it in barrels of oil equivalent. So approximately, call it $8 an MMBTU. It's roughly, $48 a barrel equivalent. So we're talking about nat gas prices in the U.S. that are high in absolute terms, but they're still half or so of crude oil. In Europe, we are, almost 10 times higher than in the U.S. So what it means to have such high prices for natural gas means effectively high electricity, means it's very difficult to compete. But the point here with the prices and volumes is very important, because we're having shortages in volumes and high prices. There's nothing you can do when you don't have the volumes, okay? You can't print natural gas. So if that natural gas is not flowing, your factory is not working, and you're going to have to close, shut down, lay off people, whatever, which is what's been happening in slow motion for a while. You could potentially address prices through subsidies. And I love this case because it's sort of back to the first question you asked, is the typical central bank and government reaction is, I cannot print natural gas, or I cannot print energy, but I can print euros to subsidize energy prices. And it might look as if you're solving the problem, because us consumers are protected, right? You say, well, I'm now only paying X for electricity or whatever. There's a couple of problems with this. The first one is that when you introduce these subsidies, yes, the consumer is capped at how much they pay, but it effectively destroys the price elasticity of demand. So effectively, to put a blunt example, in Saudi Arabia, electricity prices used to be free. So people would turn on the aircon and leave the windows open, and it didn't matter because it was free, right? It's like, who cares? Now, when you're paying the bill, it's a different story, right? So in that sense, if your prices are zero or capped, you don't fully appreciate what the real value of that is. So effectively, you don't get to have the demand destruction that you would otherwise have or need. And what it means is that prices are going to go way higher than they would have done otherwise.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that where's this money coming from? How are governments effectively paying for these subsidies? And the answer is always the same. It's printing and borrowing, right? So in some ways, the euro weakness, back to the point earlier, in my view, also comes from the fact that we have a big problem on the energy side. It's not just other structural issues, but the energy side of the story, the war between Russia and Ukraine, it's impacting us in a much bigger way than other parts of the world, and particularly the US, which has a major competitive advantage on the energy side. Asia is also in trouble on the energy side, and these are things that effectively eventually show up through the currency. The currency is always the degree of freedom of the system. You can ask Chavez in Venezuela or whoever, they pretend they can do whatever they want, they can expropriate, they can force things and do this and that and spend or whatever. Ultimately, the currency is the judge. And I think we're seeing all these things kind of aligning for stronger dollar, where under normal circumstances you would have seen a much more defensive, Fed, because they obviously would worry about a very strong dollar. In this particular case, I think things have changed, and a strong dollar actually is somewhat welcomed in the sense that they're exporting their biggest problem, which is inflation, and that is effectively hitting the other guys in a double or triple way. So it's very closely, as we discussed earlier, all these dynamics are very closely interlinked, but ultimately the basic model we discussed earlier works very well. If in trouble, print and borrow and subsidize and nationalize and do whatever, and this will eventually always show up through the currency and other imbalances such as inflation and bubbles, which effectively lead the country in a way worse position than they started. So this is why I'm so critical of these abusive, negligent policies without limits.
If you enjoyed this video clip, click here to watch another one you should like.